So it appears that in my previous video I may have ruffled some feathers. And it appears to be mainly due to the fact that I made a statement in which I claimed that Rabbinic Judaism is an illegitimate response to the destruction of the temple. So in this video, I'd like to take time to explain what I meant by that and why I said that. Are you ready? Let's go. After the destruction of the temple, the rabbis decided to take it upon themselves to come up with a way as a response to fulfill the requirements of the Torah without the sacrificial system, without the temple and all that it includes. But I call this system illegitimate because of the fact that it was never sanctioned by Torah. But how is it that the rabbis are then able to follow through with this system and claim that it's completely valid? We find examples and explanations in places like the Talmud in Berachot 26b, where it tells us the fact that the rabbis looked at the prayers that they did almost as a replacement or substitution to the sacrifices that would happen. So the daily sacrifices, those time slots, were then replaced with prayers that would be done in those times. When we go to other places in the Talmud, such as Rosh Hashanah 16b, we find examples such as calling out to God in repentance, or doing deeds of charity, that these are also replacements for the sacrifices, though we do find other interesting examples such as changing your name or changing the place where you live. Regardless of how well-intentioned these solutions may have been, they were not sanctioned by the Torah. However, you will find those people that will say, but wait a second. What about during the time of the destruction of the first temple, where Daniel was able to pray 3 times a day, and he would pray towards Jerusalem, and he was a righteous man? If you deny that what we're doing is good, then you are denying Daniel and what happened with him. Are you saying that he was not righteous or an illegitimate prophet? But this is when we have to be realistic and take a look at this example very, very well. Let's take a trip down through history. In the year 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar comes into Israel. He takes the Hebrew people captive and burns down the temple complex. Some sources even claim that the temple was left burning for 24 hours. In addition to this, we find that many of the vessels that were used in the temple for the worship were stolen, taken by King Nebuchadnezzar and his people. And during this time of the Babylonian exile, we do find that Daniel does indeed pray towards the temple 3 times a day. But there are some things that are just slightly different from what happened then to what we see now. For starters, the temple wasn't completely destroyed. Yes, it was left mostly in ruins, but parts of it still remain. Second, Daniel was indeed a righteous man, and he was living a holy life, not only with large things such as abstaining from idolatry, but even simple things such as not partaking from the king's food. Moreover, when we look at the time difference between the destruction of the second temple till now and the time between the destruction of the first temple till the Hebrew people get it back, it's a completely disproportionate comparison. For us, since the destruction of the second temple, it has been 2,000 years. Conversely, when we look at Daniel, we see that the destruction of the temple happened in 586 BC. However, when King Cyrus comes along, he declares and decrees that the land is to be given back to the Hebrew people, that they are allowed to rebuild their temple, and he even gifts back all of the things that were stolen from the temple, and he gives them back to the Hebrew people just a mere 50 years later. And surely the temple wasn't built right away, it took some time, but it's very interesting to note that there was a 50-year gap between the destruction and the decree of King Cyrus. But why is this important? Going back to the Torah, in the book of Leviticus chapter 25, we see the laws regarding the Yovel, or the Jubilee years. This Yovel, this Jubilee year, is a period of 50 years in which land is returned back to those who once owned it. So it is interesting to note that King Cyrus declares that the land would be returned back to the Hebrew people a Yovel later after the destruction of the temple. So again, the comparison that the rabbis try to make here just doesn't fall into place correctly. But here's something else that I find very interesting within the Talmud itself. We find that the sages tell us about the fact that 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Yom Kippur sacrifices were no longer accepted. And the way that they knew this was because of the fact that there were signs that they would look to see if the sacrifice for Yom Kippur was accepted or not. The signs included a scarlet thread that would be tied to the lamb's horn, and if it turned white, they knew that the sacrifice was accepted. But 40 years before the destruction of the temple, it didn't happen. They also expected their lot with God's name to land at the right hand of the priest, but it never did anymore 40 years before the destruction of the temple. In addition to that, the candelabrum that would be at the westernmost wall would no longer remain continually lit. These and other signs showed the sages and the rabbis that the Yom Kippur sacrifice was no longer being accepted exactly 40 years before the destruction of the temple. And here is, again, why this is interesting. Because 40 years before the destruction of the temple is when Yeshua of Nazareth begins his public ministry. You may call it a coincidence, but I think it's undeniably interesting to note that 40 years before the destruction of the temple, when Yeshua begins his public ministry, we find almost as in response the fact that the Yom Kippur sacrifices were no longer being accepted. And let's keep adding to the interesting notes. I find a quite compelling comparison when we take a look at these 40 years when Yeshua steps into the scene where God is offering the Hebrew people a solution, but the Hebrew people instead complain and doubt. And during this time, our sacrifices were no longer being accepted, leaving us in basically a spiritual wilderness. And this almost second Exodus leaves us with a comparison with the first Exodus, in which our people were given a promise to be taken to a place where God had destined them to go. But our people instead complain and they doubt. So again, we're seeing our people go through this 40-year wilderness in which they are being led by Yehoshua, and the followers include a mixed multitude and Kalev, whose name means wholehearted. Now, when we fast forward to the example seen with Yeshua, which is, by the way, a shortened version of the name Yehoshua, we find that those that are wholeheartedly devoted to him, and a mixed multitude including the Hebrew people, Jews, and the Goyim, the Gentiles, they are the ones that are taken to the place where God had destined them to go, the new Messianic kingdom. Now, you can accept or deny this comparison, but there is something that remains absolutely true and undeniable. And that is that at the destruction of the temple, our Hebrew people, the Jews, were left with two options. They were either to accept Rabbinic Judaism, which is the solution that the rabbis give us, or conversely, the solution that was presented by Yeshua of Nazareth. Accept him as Messiah and let him guide you into the promised land, which is the Messianic kingdom. And of course, while I will admit that I believe that the latter is the true solution, this video is actually not a defense or apologia for Catholicism or for Christianity. It is simply to state that there is a very obvious fact, and that is that Rabbinic Judaism is an illegitimate response. And we find this to be true in the evidence that over these 2,000 years, there has been no restitution and there has been no repair regarding the priesthood, the temple, the court, and all of the things that went along with that old covenant system. However, Messiah Yeshua does offer us a solution through the new and eternal covenant that he makes through his own sacrifice. So while this video is not meant to be an apologetics video for Christianity, I would like to extend an invitation for my Hebrew brothers and sisters, the Jewish people. The rabbis have left us with solutions that do not satisfy what God had asked of us. For 2,000 years, we have attempted to do it on our own, but it just hasn't worked. And we will never be able to satisfy God's request on our own. But this is where Yeshua comes in. God himself offers his righteousness to us by accepting his sacrifice and living according to the new covenant which he established. So while it may be difficult to understand or to accept, I still extend this invitation because what the rabbis have offered us is nothing more than short. Alright folks, I hope you have enjoyed this video or at least watched it till the end. I know that there are still many questions and I will do my best to continue to dive on this topic, but this is where I leave it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed week. Shalom.